All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling some of the real fundamentals in ABA, the stuff that really underpins how we create those lasting behavior changes.
Yeah, exactly. It's like getting those basic tools down in any field, right? Like before you can build anything impressive, you got to know how to use a hammer and nails and all that.
Absolutely. And we're talking about things like stimulus control, habituation, how we set goals, and prompting. You're probably listening to this because, well, you want to get a better handle on these concepts and really see how they work in practice, right? So that's what we're here to do, break it all down in a way that you can use day to day.
Definitely. And, we're drawing a lot from, let me see. Yeah, Chapter 17, Achieving Stimulus Control. It's a really solid resource for understanding all of this.
Sure.
And it even goes into, how to make those behavior changes stick, which is huge.
So, okay, stimulus change. Let's start there. The chapter defines it as basically, changing a behavior by adding or taking away something before the behavior happens. They call those antecedent stimuli, right? I feel like something is pretty broad.
Oh, it is. It is. Stimulus change can be like a whole bunch of things. They've got some great examples in the book. Like, say you rearrange furniture for someone with dementia to, help them be less agitated. That's changing their physical environment. Or maybe you tweak what snacks are available in a break room to encourage more staff interaction.
Right. That's messing with the motivational and social stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are we really getting out of it when we use stimulus change on purpose? Like, what are the good things about it?
Well, I think a big one is that it can be really effective for influencing behavior, especially when we apply it, consistently and in a way that makes sense. It's also pretty flexible, right? We can adjust all sorts of things in the environment to try and get that positive impact.
So, tons of options.
Yeah.
But it's not a magic bullet, right? There are going to be limitations and challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some of those if you rely on stimulus change alone?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Like, if we ignore the consequences that are keeping that behavior going, then just changing the stimulus might not be enough. It's like trying to control the temperature in a room only by opening and closing windows, but not touching the thermostat. It needs those consequences to really work. Plus, you got to be consistent with it. It's not a one-time thing. And it might not stop unwanted behaviors entirely. It's more about making the desired behaviors more likely.
Right. So you're tilting the scales, not eliminating one side entirely. Makes sense. The chapter also talks about why sometimes that stimulus control where a behavior happens more when a specific stimulus is there, sometimes it just doesn't develop.
Yeah, that happens. A bunch of reasons why. Maybe the stimuli we're using, as cues, maybe they're too subtle or they're not always there. Could be that the stimulus has, a bad history for the person, like it was connected to something negative in the past. That'll mess things up. Or there might be other stuff happening in the environment, what we call interfering stimuli that are distracting. And this is big, if the desired behavior isn't reinforced when it happens, or if the person's needs or motivations make the reinforcer less effective, well, then the stimulus control is less likely to develop.
Right, got to make sure that reinforcer's actually reinforcing.
Exactly.
So it's really about making sure everything's working together, not just changing one thing and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about habituation. This is something we all deal with, day to day. What's the official definition, though, in the context of behavior analysis?
So habituation, it's basically when our response to something decreases after we've been exposed to it over and over again. But the thing is that something is usually neutral, not threatening. If it's something scary or dangerous, then different things are going on.
Can you give us a real world example of habituation, something everyone can relate to?
Sure, yeah. Imagine you move next to a busy road, right? Those first few nights, that traffic noise might keep you up. But over time, you get used to it, you realize it's not dangerous, and you barely notice it anymore. Your reaction to that sound has habituated.
That's a perfect example. So how does this idea of getting used to something play into what we do in ABA? Why is it important?
Well, understanding habituation is crucial when we're introducing something new during an intervention. We don't want to overwhelm people, especially folks who have sensory sensitivities. If we just throw a new stimulus at them all of a sudden, it can lead to some bad reactions before habituation even has a chance to kick in. We got to find that balance where the stimulus is noticeable enough to do its job, but not so intense that it becomes aversive.
Right. Makes you think about how you introduce anything new, not just in ABA.
Yeah.
Okay, on to goal setting. We all set goals, but what's the specific approach in ABA?
In ABA, we're talking about defining objectives for behavior change in a way that's Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound SMART goals, as they call them.
Right. SMART goals.
And the chapter, it makes this cool point that well-defined goals can actually act as motivating operations.
Hold on. How can a goal be motivating?
Okay, so when you have a clear goal, it's basically like you're setting up a desired outcome, right? And that can create this state of motivation, this drive to do the things that'll get you to that goal. The goal itself becomes something you're working towards, and that shapes your behavior now.
Makes sense. And the chapter breaks down different types of goals too, right?
Yeah. It talks about ultimate long-range outcomes, like the big picture changes we want to see. Then there's bottom line results, which are the concrete impacts of those changes. And in between, we've got those intermediate enabling goals, like the stepping stones that get you there. And then finally, the sub-goals, the smaller, more immediate tasks. It's like this whole hierarchy where everything supports the level above it.
So it's not just saying, I want to be better at this. It's about breaking it down into those smaller, concrete steps.
Totally.
So how do we set effective goals in ABA then? What are the things to keep in mind?
Well, first off, whenever possible, get the individual involved. It's their goals, after all, right?
Right, absolutely.
We got to be super clear about the specific behaviors we're aiming to change. And this is big, that participatory goal-setting thing. It can be so empowering for people. Also, we got to set goals for how often or how long we want to see that behavior, not just that it happens at all. And this is something I've tripped up on before. We got to make sure the goals aren't too easy to reach, because if they are, it can actually undermine motivation. You don't feel like you're really making progress. And lastly, goals should be flexible. We got to review them and adjust them as needed based on how the person's doing and if anything changes in their situation.
It's like those goals are living documents, not set in stone.
Exactly.
Okay, the book specifically calls out sub-goals as being important. Why is that?
Sub-goals are great because they give you more chances to reinforce and to really track how things are going. They give you that feedback loop. Figure 17.1 in the chapter, the one about safety performance. It shows this perfectly. By breaking down that big goal into smaller, easier to manage chunks, people can see themselves succeeding more often, and that can be seriously motivating. Plus, it helps us see if what we're doing is actually working.
It's like you get those little wins along the way. Keeps you going.
Makes sense.
Okay, let's move on to prompting. I think a lot of people are familiar with this, even if they don't know the official term. So what is a prompt in ABA?
A prompt is basically any stimulus you give before a behavior that helps the person respond correctly or, in the way you want them to. And the chapter gets into this important distinction between response prompts and stimulus prompts.
Okay, what's the difference?
Response prompts, they act directly on the person's behavior. Like you give them verbal instructions, you show them how to do it, or you even physically guide them. Stimulus prompts, on the other hand, those are about changing the task or the materials themselves to make the right response more likely. So adding pictures to a worksheet or highlighting the important parts of an instruction.
So if I say, don't forget to wash your hands, that's a response prompt. But if I put a little picture of hand washing by the sink, that's a stimulus prompt.
Exactly. And using prompts the right way, that's a real skill. The chapter emphasizes 3 big things. First, use the least intrusive prompt you can, the one that still gets the job done. Second, give the prompt before or as the person tries to respond. And third, and this is super important, have a plan for how you're going to fade that prompt out over time.
Prompt fading, right. Got to build that independence. The book talks about minimum to maximum and maximum to minimum prompting too. Can you break those down for us?
So minimum to maximum, you start with the least help and only add more support if the person needs it. The good thing about this is that you're giving them the chance to be independent from the start. But it could lead to more mistakes if the initial prompts aren't strong enough. Maximum to minimum, you go the other way. You start with most help, guarantee success, and then slowly reduce the help as they get it. This can minimize errors and build confidence, but you gotta be careful not to make them rely too much on those early strong prompts.
Right. We don't want to create prompt dependence where they can only do it with the prompt. The book also mentions stimulus overdependence and overselectivity. What are those and how do we deal with them?
Stimulus overdependence is basically another way of saying prompt dependence. It's when the person only responds right when that specific prompt is there, even if they actually know how to do it without it. Stimulus overselectivity is when they focus on just one part of a stimulus and they don't respond to the other important features. The chapter talks about this thing called the DOR technique, differential observing responses, to help with overselectivity.
Okay, what's that? How does it work?
So with DOR, You only reinforce the person for paying attention to all the important parts of the stimulus before they respond. So like in figure 17.4, they're teaching a kid to recognize the Hebrew letter Aleph. They change up different features of the letter, like the angle and the length of the lines, and the kid only gets reinforced when they look at all the key features before they say what the letter is, even with those changes.
So it's like really making sure they're processing the whole thing, not just focusing on one tiny detail and getting lucky.
Yep, that's the idea.
Okay, last thing from the chapter, the importance of fluency. We often focus on just getting it right, but fluency seems like a whole other level.
Oh, it is. It is. Fluency means doing something right and at a speed that actually works in real life. The chapter makes the point that you've got to keep practicing even after someone can do it correctly to build that fluency. That leads to faster, more consistent performance, and they're more likely to remember the skill later on. And a key point here is that how fast someone can do something is often more useful than just whether they got it right or wrong. That's where precision teaching comes in. And using those turning conventions, like in figures 17.7 and 17.8, those help us track and build fluency.
Right, so it's not just about eventually getting it right, it's about being able to do it smoothly and quickly when you need to.
Yeah, exactly. Like think about reading. It's not enough to just be able to sound out each word. You got to be able to read fluently to really enjoy a book.
That's a great analogy. Again, we've covered a lot of ground here. So, big picture, what are some of the challenges ABA professionals might face when they're trying to use these principles in the real world?
Oh, there are definitely some hurdles, like making sure our stimulus changes actually stick, that they're not just a temporary fix. That can be tricky. And being able to tell the difference between habituation and extinction, because they can look similar sometimes, but you got to handle them differently. And then figuring out goals that are effective and motivating, but also work for each individual person. That takes a lot of thought and teamwork. And then there's, the whole prompt fading thing. Finding that sweet spot where you're promoting independence, but not creating dependence.
Right. It's a balancing act.
It is. It is. And then tackling those stimulus overdependence and overselectivity issues, those often need like really systematic and creative approaches. And finally, building fluency in new skills. That takes time and effort. You got to be consistent.
Yeah, those are all real world challenges that folks in the field are dealing with every day. So before we wrap up, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can put into practice?
Okay, so number one, when you're thinking about changing a stimulus, always think about what consequences are keeping that behavior going. You got to address those consequences too for real change. Number two, keep habituation in mind. When you're bringing in something new, start slow, see how the person reacts. Number three, get the learners involved in setting their own goals whenever you can and break those big goals down into smaller steps. More reinforcement, more chances to see progress. Number four, have a solid plan for fading prompts right from the start. Don't wait till it's a problem. Number five, teach people to pay attention to all the parts of a stimulus, not just one little thing. And think about using stuff like DOR if you need to. And finally, remember to work on fluency, even when someone's got the accuracy down. That's what helps them really use those skills in real life.
Those are some great practical tips. So to wrap up our deep dive today, we've gone deep into some really important ABA principles. How we can use stimulus control by making changes in the environment, the role of habituation, the power of setting clear goals, and the whole process of using and fading prompts to help people learn and become more independent.
And understanding these core ideas, they're really the foundation for doing ABA effectively, for creating real and lasting change for the people we're working with. It's not just theory, it's about using these tools in a thoughtful and consistent way to make a positive difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as you go about your day, here's something to think about. How are you using these principles in your work right now? Is it consistent, systematic? What's one small tweak you could make today, even just in how you're thinking about stimulus control, habituation, goals, or prompting that could have a big impact on the people you work with? Think about how all these ideas connect and how they play out in your everyday practice in ABA. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everyone.
Thanks for having me.